France supported the dictator Ben Ali again up to the last minute. In fact, past the last minute, a French minister actually went to Tunisia for a vacation right in the middle of the uprising, which caused a kind of a scandal. Obama did the same with Mubarak. Support him till the end. When you can't support him any longer, there's a routine game plan which is put into motion over and over again. When your favorite dictator is in trouble, support him as long as possible. When it becomes impossible, say the army turns against him, send him off somewhere, to Sharm el-Sheikh in this case, to Paris in the case of Duvalier and so on, and then issue ringing declarations about your love of democracy and count on the intellectual classes to repeat it with great awe, and then proceed to try to restore the old regime as much as you can. In particular, the crucial elements. For the United States, the crucial elements are the socioeconomic policies. I mean, they don't care if the people who take over are Wahhabis, Buddhists, like red, green, black, they can be anything, as long as they follow the right policies. So try to restore those policies and as much of the structure of the old regime as possible. Crucially, try to prevent democracy. That's very important. Democracy is recognized to be a very serious threat, not just by the United States, by the Western allies altogether. And there are very simple reasons for that. To the extent that a state is democratic, it'll reflect public opinion. That's what democracy means. So what's public opinion? Well, there are many polls of Arab public opinion taken by the most prestigious U.S. polling agencies, some elsewhere, some in Doha, and they're consistent. They show that in the Arab world, the major enemy is considered to be Israel. The second major enemy, not far behind, is the United States. Iran is generally disliked, but it's not considered much of a threat. In fact, opposition to U.S. policy is so strong that in several polls, a large part of the population, sometimes a majority, thinks the region would be better off if Iran had nuclear weapons. Well, are those the policies that the Western powers want to see implemented? No. So therefore they have to block democracy. And it's not just in the Arab world. That's across the board. Plenty of good scholarship on this.
قبل الدخول في موضوع إيران أريد أن أبقى قليلا مع الأوضاع في مصر. إذا بنينا على نفس النظرية التي قدمتموها الآن، لابد أن صانع القرار في واشنطن إذا كان مضطرا إلى الوصول إلى تلك النقطة الأخيرة، وهي قبول أن ذلك الدكتاتور الذي كان يعمل لحسابه أو كان في توافق معه ينبغي عليه أن يبتعد. صانع القرار ينظر حواليه، ماذا سيكون البديل؟ إلى أي مدى فكرت واشنطن، إن كانت قد فكرت في البديل، وإلى أي مدى تعتقد أن السياسة الأمريكية الآن مع يعني من صعدوا من تيارات إسلامية سواء في تونس أو في مصر، ربما مصر بشكل أكثر دلالة، ستستمر على نهجها؟ هل هو شهر عسل مؤقت؟ ماذا تتوقع أن يحدث للعلاقة بين مصر الإخوان وواشنطن؟
Depends on what positions the Muslim Brotherhood takes when they're in power. If they take positions satisfactory to the United States, they're fine. The United States has nothing, no opposition to Islamists. I mean, take a look at Saudi Arabia. Don't have to describe to you what it is, but they're the closest ally in the region. The U.S. supports them just as British did. If the Muslim Brotherhood adopts the same neoliberal programs that Mubarak did, if he maintains the same security relations with the United States and its allies, with Israel, that Mubarak did, then they're fine. I mean, if they, don't want, say if it's like Saudi Arabia and they don't want women to drive and so on, well, none of our business. So it just depends on the policies. The same with anyone else.
ماذا ترى الآن فيما يخص هذه السياسات؟ ما تقييمك للعلاقة الآن بين القاهرة وواشنطن؟ هل الإخوان المسلمون في توافق الآن مع الولايات المتحدة؟
For the first few months of the Morsi government, it wasn't entirely clear, I think. He made some moves that the United States didn't approve of. Not much, but some. And it seemed that they might be moving towards a degree of independence. And then U.S. support was correspondingly qualified. But as far as I can tell, increasingly, the Morsi government is moving towards reestablishing something like the previous regime, the previous system. There have been changes and significant ones. There's much more freedom of speech. There's freedom for labor organizing. Those are very important developments. But the political, economic options that seem to be the objectives of the regime are not too far from what existed before. So, for example, they're not interfering with the role of the military in controlling a large part of the economy. As far as I can tell, there's no change in the close relations between the Mukhabarat and the CIA. And in a variety of domains, they seem to be acting in a way that's in accord with U.S. wishes.
اسمح لي أن أضع أمامكم مجموعة من الأسئلة من شباب مصر والعرب، سواء على تويتر أو على فيسبوك، بعض من مواقع التواصل الاجتماعي. أولها سؤال من زينوبيا: كيف سيؤثر ربيع العرب حتى الآن في توازن صناع القرار في أمريكا؟
The Arab Spring is a work in process that hasn't finished. It's in the middle, and it depends where it goes. At the beginning, the U.S. and its allies were deeply concerned that the Arab Spring might move towards democracy and independence. That's been curtailed in the countries that are most important to the West, namely the oil dictatorships. Very little has happened. There's some stirrings, but efforts to join the Arab Spring were crushed pretty quickly, with some violence, in fact, particularly eastern Saudi Arabia, where most of the oil is. As long as they're stable, the oil dictatorships, the West is more or less satisfied. In Tunisia and Egypt, there was progress for the popular movements, but it's, at the moment, steady. We'll have to see where it goes. And I think the West is so far reasonably satisfied with the outcome, but concerned. Remember, the Arab Spring isn't happening out of nowhere. There are changes like this all over the world. Take, say, Latin America. I mean, for 500 years, Latin America was under the control of the Western imperial powers. In the last century or more, of the United States. In fact, it was just taken for granted. There was very little planning even for Latin America. They're our backyard. They do what we tell them. Well, 10 years ago, after 500 years, Latin America began to move towards independence and autonomy. It's happened in the past, but in the past, the United States always crushed it very quickly. Violent military coups, murderous dictatorships, and so on. This time they couldn't. South America has become significantly independent. It's moved towards integration. It's some of the major countries have essentially freed themselves from the IMF. U.S. military bases have been driven out of the continent, and they're following their own paths. There was, just a few months ago, there was a hemispheric conference And the outcome was inconceivable 15 or 20 years ago. There was a series of issues, Cuba, drugs, others. On every one, the United States and Canada were isolated, totally isolated. In fact, by now there is a Latin American organization, including the whole hemisphere, minus the United States and Canada, which is CELAC, which is beginning to function. These things were unimaginable not many years ago. And that's in the back of the minds of planners and strategists when they see what's happening in the Middle East, which is of much greater significance to them than Latin America because of its energy resources, its strategic position, and so on.
سؤال آخر من أحمد جبر يقول: هل تعتقد أن الأمر سيختلف فيما يخص الشرق الأوسط إن فاز أوباما أو فاز رومني؟
Well, you know, it's very hard to know what to expect from Romney and Ryan. Their stated positions are so outlandish that they'd probably destroy the United States, even domestically. And internationally, they're almost crazy. So if they were elected, they couldn't implement their actual stated positions. I mean, power centers in the United States wouldn't allow it. It would be too destructive. But it's pretty extreme. They're dangerous. Obama will be more or less what he has been, which I don't particularly admire, but you know, it's better than what the alternative might be. So yes, there's a difference.
سؤال آخر من آزلازا: أي نصيحة توجهها لمصر كي تبقى متحدة وتكمل ثورتها بنجاح؟
To Egypt? You mean to the Egyptian people or to the Egyptian government? That's a different Egypt. No?
هي تقول مصر، لكن دعنا نسأل ماذا عن الاثنين؟ ماذا عن الحكومة وأيضا عن الشعب، خاصة هؤلاء الذين آمنوا ولا يزالون يؤمنون بالثورة في مصر؟
Well, for the Egyptian government, I'd have the same advice as to most governments. Resign and let popular forces elect democratic governments. So that'd be my advice to them.
Okay.
To the population in Egypt, I would, you know, it's easy for me from the outside to give advice, but because the consequences would not be simple. But I would hope to see that I think what's likely to happen is that the hopes and aspirations of the revolution will not be satisfied by the current regime. In fact, I think things may get worse. They probably will begin to impose the kind of austerity programs that are being imposed in Southern Europe with very harmful effects. You can't blame this particularly on the IMF. They've been backing off from those programs, but the U.S. is certainly behind them. I suspect they'll be imposed. The poverty level is already extremely high. Severe poverty is enormously high. People are having difficulty surviving. And austerity programs, if they're introduced, will make it worse. The aspirations for more democratic freedoms, I suspect, will not be satisfied. A lot has been won and looks as though that's going to stay. People are going to protect it. But there's much more that should happen. If this is correct, there's likely to be a revival of confrontations, Tahrir Square demonstrations and so on. They're likely to be harshly repressed by the police and army, especially if the army feels threatened. So far the army hasn't been threatened. You know, some changes in personnel, but doesn't mean much. But if the military control over large parts of the economy is threatened, as would happen under a more democratic regime, they're going to fight back. That's their main concern. And that could lead to a difficult confrontation, and popular forces will be facing hard problems. I hope they'll be able to deal with them.
إذا نظرنا إلى الشمال قليلا نحو سوريا، لدينا الآن نحو 40,000 شهيد في سوريا، وأرقام أخرى كثيرة مفجعة فيما يخص المصابين والنازحين إلى آخره. عندما سئل المتنافسان الآن على الفترة الرئاسية القادمة في الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية أثناء المناظرة، باراك أوباما قال إن إدارته نجحت حتى الآن في عزل الحكومة السورية أو النظام السوري الآن، بينما ميت رومني يرى فيما يحدث في سوريا فرصة an opportunity. كيف تقيم تعامل الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية مع ما يحدث في سوريا مقارنة على سبيل المثال بما حدث بدورها فيما حدث في ليبيا على سبيل المثال، وتأثيرات يعني نتيجة محتملة لما يحدث في سوريا على بقية المنطقة وبكل تأكيد خاصة الإسرائيليين؟
Let's put aside Romney because I doubt if he knows what he means, but so we'll put that to the side. But for the U.S. administration, actually they had fairly decent relations with Assad. He kept things quiet. He cooperated with what they call their war on terrorism. He kept the border with Israel stable. They had no basic objections. They don't like him. They'd rather have a more obedient alternative. But I don't think they see it in the Free Syrian Army. In fact, those forces have elements that the U.S. doesn't like and doesn't know what they would do. So they're staying aside. They're giving some intelligence operation. Doubtless the CIA is all over the place. There may be special forces, but they're not doing very much. Now they claim they can't do anything because of the Russian veto, but that's like people who believe in Santa Claus. If they want to do something, they wouldn't care about a Russian veto. They're probably grateful for the Russian veto. It gives an excuse not to do anything. And rather strikingly, Israel isn't doing anything. Israel could take simple actions which would help the rebels. For example, Israel could mobilize forces in the Golan Heights the way it did in 1970, which deterred Syrians from moving to Jordan to protect the Palestinians. If Israel mobilized forces there, no intervention, Assad would be compelled to transfer forces from the north, where the fighting is, to the Golan region, which would indirectly relieve the Syrian rebels. But there's no indication that they're doing it, or that the U.S. is asking them to do it, which strongly suggests that they don't particularly want to see a rebel victory. They presumably are happy to let the Syrians continue to slaughter each other. It's reminiscent of the Iraq-Iran war, where the U.S. was basically supporting both sides. If they keep slaughtering each other, that's fine with us. We don't like either of them, but they can kill each other.
دعني أطرح أمامكم بعض المداخلات من فيسبوك، موقع التواصل الاجتماعي فيسبوك. أعتقد هذا من مشترك من ليبيا الشقيقة، اسمه أو يسمي نفسه تريبولي بي كي. ماذا تريد أمريكا من بلد ليبيا بدعمها ثورتنا وتمويلها بعض التيارات الإسلامية؟
You have to remember that the United States, France, and Britain supported Gaddafi quite strongly to the very end. If we had time, I'd give details, but I'll just say it. They did support him. Then they turned against him. I presume, here we can again speculate. When we're talking about the 1970s, we have documents. When we're talking about what happens now, we're speculating. It looks as though what happened is that the United States and its allies felt that they could gain a more obedient, pliable regime if they joined the rebels as essentially their air force. Notice that intervention was not in accord with the UN resolution. The UN resolution in 1973 called for a no-fly zone and a ceasefire. Okay, that's basically what it called for. It called for measures to protect civilians, unspecified. The U.S. and Britain observed that for about 5 minutes, and France, and then turned immediately to becoming the Air Force of the rebel army, which is not in the resolution. And they continued. And actually, most of the world was against that. The African Union was strongly opposed. It called for it's an African country, after all. African Union called for a ceasefire, as in the resolution, and efforts at negotiation and diplomacy. The BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, which is a growing bloc, same, called for negotiations and diplomacy. Even the International Crisis Group, which is the main international NGO dealing with these things, had the same position. And Turkey at first supported the same position, then it shifted. Germany as well. The three imperial powers were kind of isolated. But finally, with a sufficient show of force, they won. There's now plenty of problems. Right now, this morning's newspapers, in fact, describe uprisings in Beni Walid. That's the main center of, actually, the biggest tribe in Libya, the Warfala tribe. And Sirte, the other one, was very severely destroyed. And there's conflicts going on, but there's some prospects for emergence of a more or less decent regime. I hope it happens. But
يبقى لنا سؤال أو سؤالان من موقع التواصل الاجتماعي تويتر. يعني مشترك يسمي نفسه سيلافي. شايف العرب ازاي بعد 20 سنة من دلوقتي؟
40 years ago, I wrote an article in which I pointed out something pretty obvious. The Arab world has one major resource, the oil resources. That's a wasting resource. It's not there forever. It's for a certain period of time. It provides an opportunity for development, modernization, the creating of functioning societies that can sustain themselves. If that opportunity is wasted, the entire Arab world is going to be in a lot of trouble. It doesn't have many other resources. I mean, in principle it does, like Egypt. It could have, if you go back to the early 19th century, Egypt under Muhammad Ali, for example, it could have undergone the same kind of industrial revolution that the United States did. Had a rich agriculture, developing society, but Britain wouldn't permit it. They blocked and intervened and didn't let it happen. They couldn't do it in the United States because the United States had liberated itself. It's still a possibility, but there's not a lot of time to waste. And unless it's done soon and using the resources that are available, which shouldn't just be, those resources are more valuable in the ground than they are giving them away for Western traffic jams. Unless something like that is done, I think the entire region will be in serious trouble. 20 years from now depends on the course of events like the Arab Spring.
ربنا يستر. أخيرا أنا أعلم كما يعلم الجميع اهتمامك بالقضايا العربية وباللغة العربية. أنت على أي حال يعني أشهر أستاذ في اللغويات على مستوى العالم في الفترة الأخيرة، ومفكر كبير وفيلسوف كبير أيضا، وتعلم اللغة العربية. تعلمت اللغة العربية وأنت صغير، وقرأت كثيرا من منتجات اللغة العربية في الأدب والفكر، منها على سبيل المثال رواية الأيام، وهي سيرة ذاتية للكاتب الكبير رحمه الله دكتور طه حسين. ماذا يبقى في الذاكرة من الأيام لديك؟
That was 60 years ago, so don't ask me too many questions, but I was quite impressed by it as a literary work and as a reflect as an introduction into what life was like for people in his circumstances and what problems they faced, what the nature of Egyptian society was like. It's kind of like reading Mahfouz for an earlier period, but him in English, I read in translation. Unfortunately, I didn't keep this capacity in the language alive, so now I don't have it. I'm sorry, I don't. But I was very much interested in, I studied Arabic pretty intensively when I was a teenager in college. And actually I had intentions then, you know, romantic intentions of going to the Middle East and working for Arab-Jewish cooperation in a socialist Palestine, working class cooperation. I wanted to be fluent in Arabic and English. And in fact, I was Arabic and Hebrew. I knew Hebrew pretty well. And in fact, when I lived in a kibbutz in Israel for a while, and again 60 years ago, and I was able to get to Arab villages. I knew just about enough to kind of understand a casual conversation that was interesting and learn things, but I just couldn't keep it up.
شكرا لك، شكرا جزيلا بروفيسور تشومسكي على وقتك وعلى دعمك للعرب وللقضايا العادلة للعرب وللإنسانية بشكل عام. أتمنى لك وقتا ممتعا فيما يتبقى لك من ساعات في القاهرة، ورحلة سعيدة سالمة إلى موطنك إن شاء الله. شكرا لك مرة أخرى، شكرا جزيلا. شكرا لكم سيداتي وسادتي. غدا يوم جديد وحدث